welcome back after this short break. Our next speaker is Amber Butchart. I met Amber for the first time last night after she's been traveling all the way from UK to come here to Steneby. But I contacted Amber after reading her article, "The Artificial Divide Between Fine Art and Textile is a Gendered Issue," as I thought the article was so good. I asked Amber if she wanted to develop the ideas in the article for our seminar. Lucky us, she said yes. Amber Butchart is a fashion historian, author and broadcaster who specializes in the historical intersections between dress, politics and culture. She's a former research fellow at the University of the Arts, London, and is a regular public lecturer at the UK's leading institutions, from the Tate to the VA and worldwide. She also researches and presents documentaries for the BBC, including the 6-part series A Stitch in Time for BBC 4, that fused biography, art and the history of fashion to explore the lives of historical figures through the clothes they wore. Her publications include The Fashion of Film, Nautical Chick, and a history of British fashion illustration for the British Library. Her latest book, The Fashion Chronicles, Style Stories of History's Best Dressed, is out now. With such a resume, I'm of course super excited that Amber accepted my invitation to come here to Steneby and this year's seminar of To Perform Body. Warmly welcome, Amber Butchart.
Is that working? Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, firstly, I feel I should apologise for the lack of explicit images in my presentation. Tom's presentation is quite a hard act to follow, so I'm afraid I might be taking it down a notch from there. Secondly, I would like to say thank you so much for having me, and thank you especially to Maya for inviting me. I've really enjoyed my time here so far. It's fantastic to see how craft is taught here and venerated so much. It's great. So yes, today I will be sort of expanding on the article that Maya mentioned, and I will be focusing largely on the UK because it's where I'm from and it's kind of my frame of reference. And there is actually some crossover with some of the points that Frida made earlier as well. So art forms using textiles have existed for millennia, but they haven't always been held in high esteem within the art world. So my argument for my presentation this afternoon, and the argument that has been made by many theorists and practitioners before me, is that the artificial divide that exists between fine art and textiles, or applied art, or decorative art, or craft, as it's called, is really a gendered issue. Now, for part of the research into the article, I interviewed a woman called Hannah Lamb of the 62 group of textile artists. This is an artist-led pressure group that has been promoting textiles as a fine art for nearly 60 years in the UK. She said textiles have always suffered as an art media because of their association with domesticity and femininity, and this is a recurring theme throughout the talk. It's actually interesting hearing Tom, this really different use of the domestic setting in a lot of the images and points that you were making, and how that sort of idea of domesticity has really been sort of subverted and made into a much more dangerous space in what you're looking at. So historically, textiles have been labelled women's work, and they have been dismissed as inferior to pursuits such as painting and sculpture. However, this has not always been the case, as I will come on to. In her book, Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years, Elizabeth Wayland Barber outlines the importance of textiles and fibre arts in the early history of women. Now, she claimed that textile production became the preserve of women at this time because it was easily adaptable to childcare. She wrote, "The crafts of spinning, weaving and sewing are repetitive, easy to pick up at any point, reasonably child-safe and easily done at home. The only other occupation that fits the criteria even half so well is that of preparing the daily food. Food and clothing, these are what societies worldwide have come to see as the core of women's work." Now, she even suggested that if 19th century scientists had been more cognizant of women's work and the importance of these developments, that instead of naming historical periods after materials such as stone, iron and bronze, they may instead have talked about the string revolution, which is something she talks about a lot in this book. Now, as a precursor to weaving, string was developed around 4,000 years ago. And she claims it opened the door to an enormous array of new ways to save labour and improve the odds of survival, much as the harnessing of steam did for the Industrial Revolution. Soft, flexible thread of this sort is a necessary prerequisite to making woven cloth. So powerful, in fact, is simple string in taming the world to human will and ingenuity that I suspect it to be the unseen weapon that allowed the human race to conquer the earth, that enabled us to move out into every eco-niche on the globe during the Upper Paleolithic. So the ephemerality of this material, of string in this case, is also an issue in establishing these histories. Stone and bronze are, of course, much more resilient and much less perishable than wool or cotton, and so are found much more frequently in the archaeological record. Now, moving forward to the notion of needlecraft as art, as something sort of decorative rather than as specifically a cover for the body, and we come to an example that has somewhat surprisingly survived. Now, this is known as the Bayeux tapestry, but it's actually an embroidery, not a tapestry. It's embroidered wool on linen, and it's the only surviving example of Romanesque political embroidery. It even managed to survive the French Revolution. There were attempts to use it as a wagon cover, or to cut it up to make a float for a carnival during the revolutionary upheaval. But thankfully, these endeavours were thwarted by local admirers of this piece. So it's one of the most well-known examples of historical embroidery, and it depicts the events surrounding the Norman conquest of England, including the accession of Edward the Confessor through to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But the piece itself is really shrouded in mystery. There's a political ambiguity throughout the story that this embroidery tells. At times it appears to be sympathetic to King Harold, although it's likely meant to function as a form of Norman propaganda. This is what theorists generally think today. Now, the embroidery itself was long believed to have been the work of Queen Matilda, William the Conqueror's wife. But this idea has been superseded by the argument that it was produced by English needleworkers, likely women and possibly nuns in Canterbury, because there was already a tradition of embroidery that would then flourish in the following centuries. Now, the names on the embroidery are rendered in English spellings, not in Norman, which suggests that the makers are English. So it leaves us with questions, many questions, this piece. Is this to be considered art? Is it to be considered craft? Is it a political tract, or is it a historical record? It was created for display, likely in a cathedral or castle, so arguably this embroidery was a fashionable item in its own right when it was created. Now, embroidery in England developed over the following years after the Norman conquest, and medieval English embroidery, known as opus Anglicanum, or English work, was prized around the world for its skill and artistry. This was made by both women and men, and it really signified the pinnacle of luxury in medieval Europe. Patrons of Opus Anglicanum have been identified from Scandinavia to Portugal and from Latvia to Greece. And many of the surviving embroideries could have been diplomatic gifts as well, and we find this with a lot of the ecclesiastical embroideries. So, enjoying an international reputation, this type of embroidery was prized at royal courts and was also commissioned by ecclesiastics for use on these type of vestments. Now, the Vatican inventory of 1295 listed over 100 examples of Opus Anglicanum, which was considered as important as painting and the work of goldsmiths. Now, teeming with elaborate imagery, the V&A in London holds the largest collection of these works, such as this, the Butler Bowden cope, as seen here. This is a red silk velvet cope embroidered with silver and silver gilt thread and coloured silks, and it features scenes from the life of the Virgin. You can see some up-close details here. I love this one on the left. Now, the body of the cope is made of red silk velvet embroidered with gold, silver and silk thread, pearls, as you can see, and small metal rings as well. The needlework is stitched through the velvet ground. It's not worked separately and then applied afterwards. Now, it's been suggested that during the 13th and early 14th centuries, most of the embroiderers appearing in documents relating to the production and trade of Opus Anglicanum were women. But over the 14th century, the references to women became rarer. It was then during the Renaissance that the separation of art and craft became much more apparent. And we begin to see a hierarchy develop that saw fine art, with its masculine associations, really prized over the craft of stitching. Now, during this time, we see an early example of women using textiles as resistance. This is a theme I'll return to later, and that's in the work of Mary, Queen of Scots, while she was under house arrest. In mid-16th century England, Mary, Queen of Scots, was seen as a threat by the reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, because she had a really strong claim to the throne, and she was championed by Catholic subjects. So Elizabeth was a Protestant queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic. This was a time in British history where there were huge ongoing schisms between the two religions. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was kept under house arrest, and she spent much of her time embroidering. Domestic needlework was a popular pastime for women in England in the 16th century, and it became customary for wealthy women to work together, embroidering individual panels which could then be sewn together to create a much larger work. So these larger lengths of fabric could then be made into curtains or covers for a bed, etc., etc. Now, the embroideries in the collections at the V&A that we see here were produced between 1569 and about 1585, while she was living in the custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury. So she wasn't kept in a cell, but she wasn't allowed to go out on her own. She was essentially sort of kept under house arrest. Now, some of the embroideries convey messages relating to her position at this time. Here we can see a phoenix representing immortality and regeneration, and another design that she created showed a ginger cat, which was thought to have meant to be Elizabeth I, who famously had red hair, toying with this grey mouse, which was sort of represented herself. In 1586, she was tried for being part of an assassination plot against Elizabeth. She was found guilty and she was beheaded. So her needle allowed her the only means of resistance while she was under constant surveillance at this time. Now, the polarisation of fine art from textiles was really accelerated in the 18th century with the academicisation of the art world. So in Britain, the Royal Academy was founded in London in 1768, and less than 18 months later, a rule was passed that regulated what could be admitted for exhibition. the Royal Academy continues to hold its annual summer exhibition every year where you can submit work to be shown. Now, at this time, 18 months after the Academy was founded, needlework was banned. It was outlawed from the realm of high art, along with things like shell work and artificial flowers as well. Now, out of 34 founding members of the Royal Academy, only 2 were women. These were Angelica Kaufmann and Mary Moser, who was featured on one of your suffragette banners. Now, they're not pictured here in this image of the founding members of the Royal Academy because, as women, they weren't permitted in the life drawing room. So we only see them through these portraits on the wall. This is Angelica and Mary Moser up here. As women, Moser and Kaufmann were not permitted to have any role in the governance or the direction of the Academy. So although they were founding members, they had no say over the direction of it as an institution. Women were not invited to the Academy's annual dinner until 1967. Now, moving on to the 19th century, and by this point in history, competence at needlework had become a marker of fashionably refined middle and upper class femininity. Now, this association saw embroidery denigrated as women's work, as lowly craft rather than this respected fine art. Now, this is something that the feminist art historian Rosika Parker made clear in her book, The Subversive Stitch, first published in 1984. This is really one of the first studies to examine the marginalisation of women's work in the hierarchy of art and craft. To know the history of embroidery, she wrote, is to know the history of women. Now, Parker clearly asserted that the art-craft divide was a class issue as well as a gender issue. She wrote, the fine arts, painting and sculpture are considered the proper sphere of the privileged classes, while craft or the applied arts like furniture making or silversmithery are associated with the working class. Now, she continued, embroidery, by the time of the art-craft divide, was made in the domestic sphere, usually by women for love. Painting was produced predominantly, though not only by men, in the public sphere for money. So here we can see a number of areas that really fed into this hierarchy of art versus craft. As well as man versus woman, we have amateur versus professional, and private, domestic versus public. Now, Parker also wrote about this domestication of textiles and how women at times subverted the feminisation and denigration of embroidery and textile art to instead find a voice that they were denied elsewhere in public discourse throughout the 19th century. So I wanted to cover some examples of this, of women finding a voice through textile art, starting with Agnes Richter's jacket. Now, Agnes Richter lived from 1844 to 1918, and she was a seamstress who is remembered today largely for this embroidered jacket that she made while she was confined in Heidelberg Psychiatric Hospital. Richter spent the last 26 years of her life incarcerated, and a note from her file in 1902 says that she suffered from chronic madness with notions of persecution, and as a result is incapable of looking after her own affairs. And it was that incapable of looking after her own affairs, we find that a lot when we look at the history of institutionalisation of women in the 19th century. Now, she sewed this jacket while she was a resident at the institution, and some sections of the embroidered writing have been deciphered, but the meaning really remains unclear. So, for example, one section reads, I am not big, I wish to read, I plunge headlong into disaster. Her case number, 583M, appears repeatedly in the writing on the jacket. And it appears that she wore the jacket because it still has sweat stains, which really speaks to the visceral relationship that clothing has with the body, these imprints of the body that clothing can have. And also the emotionally charged association of, that clothing has as material culture. So this is a very poignant piece which speaks to the institutionalisation of women in the 19th century and these lost voices from history. Richter's voice would also likely be lost to us if it weren't for this jacket. Now, there are other examples of so-called asylum embroidery, such as that by Lorena Bulwer, who was branded as a lunatic and incarcerated in a workhouse in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk in the UK. Now, the text here is all in uppercase and it lacks punctuation, making it quite difficult to read or decode. But research has been done to try to unpick some of the text. Again, this speaks to the hidden voices of these marginalised women, which are made permanent or made visible through the permanence of these textile arts. You can find a lot more of these at Norwich Castle Museum. Now, Agnes Richter's jacket was the inspiration behind a piece created by the artist Beth Hopkins for the Wellcome Collection in London in 2016. They held an exhibition called Bedlam, the Asylum and Beyond, which really juxtaposed historical material and medical records with individual testimonies and artworks. So it was really an attempt to sort of interrogate the idea that the asylum represented. Is it a place of refuge and sanctuary and care? Looking at the sort of historical, the changing context, I guess, of this idea of the asylum. Now, as Hopkins explained, the brief behind her creating this piece was to create a piece exploring the notion of asylum, what might constitute refuge, sanctuary, and protection today. And she engaged with her own experience of mental illness and a stay that she had had at Bethlehem Hospital. So she embroidered her story onto a pillow cover. And she said, "Beds are highly symbolic to me. When I am manic, I cannot sleep. But when I'm depressed, I can sleep for over 18 hours a day. Bed is both a source of sanctuary, a place to hide from the world, and a place where negative thoughts become magnified, leading to far worse depression. The hospital pillow I was using would have had many sleepless patients lay their heads on it." So here Hopkins was drawing on her own experience, as well as that of previous institutionalised women who turned to embroidery as the only means of expression they were allowed. And Hopkins also explicitly acknowledged this gendered history of the art-craft divide. She wrote a blog for the Wellcome Collection when this piece went on display. And she said, "Women's work has often been considered a form of oppression, but equally it can be used to give voice. Agnes Richter and many other asylum patients the world over would have spent their lives sewing, locked in institutions. It would have been a diversion, a sort of sanctuary, and so it is for me, a way to pass time when it weighs heavy." Now, at the turn of the 20th century, this idea of women's voices as expressed through textile arts was politicised by the suffragettes during the fight for political enfranchisement. The time invested in textiles and hand embroidery or applique, which we see again and again on these banners, we saw some examples earlier, lends a permanence and a gravitas to messages that are conveyed in this way. And it became a medium of choice for political banners. The Artists' Suffrage League was founded by Mary Lowndes in 1907 and was made up of artists who contributed their work to the suffrage cause, including posters and banners for marches, postcards, things that could be sold to raise money for the cause as well. Now, the League created embroidered banners for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies that were carried in some of the earliest large-scale demonstrations that were held in support of women's enfranchisement. Now, examples of suffrage banners here are from the collections of the Museum of London. On the right-hand banner, we see the figure of justice is represented to emphasise the justice of the Votes for Women cause. We also see prison arrows adorning the corners of the banner, as you can see here. A reminder of the women who spent time incarcerated in support of political suffrage. And this is a sort of symbol that we see again and again and again. The arrow symbol that was used to refer to the fact that something was owned by the crown, was prison property. This is why we see arrows on some early prison uniforms as well. The left-hand banner is made by a local group in Peckham, which is in southeast London. Made of gold, green and white fabric. This was the colour scheme of the Women's Freedom League, who had created this banner. Now, colour schemes were really important for many suffrage groups, and the Pankhursts were key figures in the British suffrage movement. Emmeline and her daughter Christabel founded the militant Women's Social and Political Union in October 1903, with the motto, "Deeds, not words." This was a militant group. For the WSPU, dressing fashionably became an ideological issue. They had their own newspaper called Votes for Women, and in 1908 they ran an article that said, for the suffragette, dress is at all times a matter of importance, whether she is to appear on a public platform, a procession, or merely in house or street about her ordinary vocations. Now, the WSPU member, Elizabeth Pethick Lawrence, devised their group's colour scheme of white, green and purple with the idea of politicising appearance. So suffragettes could easily be spotted in the street. And we see these colours on a number of different types of suffrage goods that were sold in support of the cause. And also on commemorative medals, rosettes and brooches as well. So also looking at the collections in the Museum of London, we see a range of suffragette brooches. There were enamel Votes for Women pins through to Holloway brooches that were designed by Sylvia Pankhurst and were awarded by the WSPU to women who had served prison time for their actions. But I wanted to focus, of course, on the textile variations. Now we can see here on the left a rosette made of ribbons. The Votes for Women newspaper declared, "Wear the colours as a duty and a privilege. Never be seen without your badge." Now, the most viscerally evocative of these examples are a range of hunger strike medals. These were presented to women who emerged from prison having undergone barbaric forced feeding after they went on hunger strike. Now, the example on the right here was presented to the suffragette prisoner, Lady Constance Lytton, in October 1909. Now, again, through these textiles, we can see a visceral connection with women's history. The association between femininity and textiles that had become entrenched the previous century is really being used for a distinct ideological and political cause. And once again, we see embroidery being used to give women a voice. This embroidery was made by a suffragette prisoner called Janie Terrero when she was incarcerated in Holloway Prison in 1912. Now, there are a number of these surviving Holloway embroideries, as they're called, again showing that women used stitch as a voice when they were literally silenced. They were physically removed from society. Now, as I mentioned, the Women's Social and Political Union were a militant group. Janie Terrero had been a suffragist since the 1870s, and in 1908 she joined a North London branch of the WSPU. She was in her 50s when she created this embroidery. She was an accomplished musical composer, she was married and she was living in Essex. And she was serving a 4-month sentence at the time that she created this for breaking a window. This was part of a large-scale window-smashing campaign around Piccadilly Circus, when shop windows were broken using stones or using toffee hammers as sort of part of this campaign of mass disobedience. There were around 200 women that were arrested following this sort of outbreak around Piccadilly Circus. Now, Terrero went on hunger strike twice and she was force-fed. The textile historian Eileen Wheeler has written about this embroidery in particular and how it came to symbolise the suffrage cause. Writing paper was often not allowed in prison, but due to its association with servile femininity, needles and thread seem to have eluded this ban. Now, the symbols that we see here, we can see portcullis indicating the House of Commons at the top in the centre. We see again the arrow, this tag of government property, which appeared on the prison uniform. We see the toffee hammers that were used to break the windows on either side of the portcullis as well. Now, in the centre, we see the facts of her incarceration, and around the edges, we see signatures of her fellow hunger strikers. At the bottom, we've got this postcard of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. So Torero is making a statement permanent through stitching. She's recording these details for posterity. Now, Rosika Parker talked of this subversive tradition where women managed to make meanings of their own in the very medium intended to inculcate self-effacement. Now, throughout the mid to late 20th century, there were a number of predominantly female artists who continued this tradition of using textiles as a means of questioning the hierarchy of the art-craft divide. And I wanted to focus on some of them through the lens of contemporary curatorial practice that is really beginning to challenge this previous hierarchy. So this is from Annie Albers, the show at the Tate Modern. An imposing wooden structure bisected with lines of thread greeted visitors head-on at the entrance of this Annie Albers show at the Tate Modern last year. This was a shaft countermarch loom, and it was echoed at the end of the exhibition as well, with a Structo artcraft loom that had actually been used by Albers herself. This was the UK's first major retrospective of Annie Albers' work. The galleries were filled with over 350 objects, ranging from textiles to various other, to writings and prints as well. Now, bookending the exhibition with these tools of her trade really ensured that the method of creation was kept at the heart of the show. This was unapologetically about a textile artist. Annie Albers marked a momentous step for fibre arts when the former Bauhaus student became the first weaver to have a significant solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1949. Now, nearly 70 years after that moment, there has been a resurgence of textile arts on gallery walls, and the Albers exhibition is part of the Tate Modern's commitment to showing artists working in this medium, which really, I think, marks quite a breakthrough in terms of questioning this kind of hierarchy and divide. In 2015, they held a retrospective of the abstract artist Sonia Delaunay, who worked across a number of areas, including textiles and clothing. Let's see here. Now, around the UK, there has been an increase in the display of textiles. In 2017, there was an exhibition called Entangled, Threads and Making at the Turner Contemporary in Margate in Kent. Now, this exhibition really aimed to challenge these classifications of fine art, design and craft through the work of more than 40 female artists whose work included embroidery and weaving through to things like wood carving as well. Now, just last month, I was at the inaugural British Textile Biennial in Blackburn in Lancashire, which engaged with the heritage of this mill town. It's a former mill town, Blackburn, up in the sort of heart of the industrial north, I guess. So really engaged with the heritage of this mill town and others like it, as well as the surrounding area, which is steeped in this history of, cotton in Pennine, Lancashire. So the aim of this biennial was to throw a spotlight on the nation's creativity, innovation and expression in textiles against this backdrop of sort of post-industrial Lancashire. Now, one of the many brilliant artists involved was Alice Kettle, and her piece, Thread-Bearing Witness, which is a major series of embroidered works that consider issues of cultural heritage, refugee displacement and movement, while also engages with individual migrants within the wider context of the global refugee crisis. Now, the works present the individual and collective textile narratives of refugees and asylum seekers. And another artist is Raisa Kabir. Now, she is a textile and performance artist who was trained as a weaver, and she incorporates sound and video into her work. Her work is really fascinating. I think for students of textile arts, some of the pieces, the performance pieces that she does actually even involve her threading into her own body, into the soles of her feet, to really sort of physically engage with these histories and her own personal heritage and history in this way as well. Now, she highlights how the gendering of embroidery in European history not only marginalises the practice through sexism, but also ignores global histories and experiences of people of colour. So she really turns this into a radical political art form. In her words, the notion that embroidery is inherently about white feminism and that embroidery is this Victorian, white, Western phenomenon, I don't resent it, I just think that's a misconception. Politics and textiles for me are intertwined, they're not separate. Also in the north of England, just opened at the Baltic Gallery in Newcastle upon Tyne, is the first major survey of Judy Chicago, who again we heard mentioned earlier. This is also part of the dinner party, luckily a slightly different image from the ones you showed. So the exhibition that's just opened in the north of England spans Judy Chicago's 50-year career, from her early actions in the desert in the 70s to some of her most recent series. Now, her work, The Dinner Party, that we can see here at the Brooklyn Museum, is an epic retelling of women's history. At the time that it was first put on display in the late 1970s, it was dismissed as kitsch by the male critic of the New York Times. And I think that really became, or is sort of looked back to as a kind of landmark moment in terms of this hierarchy and the criticism that went along with it. He dismissed it as kitsch, completely just disregarded it entirely. It took nearly 5 years to create this work, the massive triangular banquet table, and it required the assistance of around 400 volunteers, many of whom specialised in forms of so-called domestic labour that were rarely acknowledged by the contemporary art world at the time. So things like china painting as well as the needlework that we see as well. Now, when the piece was installed at the Brooklyn Museum, she told ArtNet News, "I could neither stitch nor sew, but it turns out I had this incredible ability to design for needlework. I discovered this when I saw my paintings on fabric being translated into thread." And finally, I wanted to briefly consider Instagram as a site of contemporary curation through the work of the artist Hannah Hill. Oh, her name has come off this slide. I don't know why. This is Hannah Hill, this piece. Now, this example of her embroidery, which took 15 hours to stitch, went viral in 2016. Now, Hill is very open about the relationship between embroidery and her mental health. She talks a lot about the repetitive nature of stitching and how it can have a therapeutic effect. This is actually an idea that we're seeing picked up on a lot in various different groups around the UK at the moment, something that's echoed by many other contemporary practitioners. Now, this image is a brilliant way of connecting digital culture to handcrafts because it's a stitched version of the Arthur meme. I probably don't need to explain this, but I will anyway. Now, the fist frame itself is from an episode of the Arthur's Park cartoon from 1999, and it grew as a meme from summer 2016 following this tweet on the screen. So we sort of, saw it growing and disseminating and generally memeing, as what a verb for meme, I'm not sure, hopefully memeing. So you can hear more from both Hannah Hill and Riza Kabir, as well as many other practitioners, in a documentary that I made for Radio 4 about radical embroidery artists with a brilliant producer called Louise Morris. Now, Hannah is inspired by artists such as Yayoi Kusama and Faith Ringgold, right through to grime music. A lot of her embroidery is about grime. And in her own words, she told ID magazine, "The more I got into feminism and became obsessed with art and learning about the history of textiles within art and the feminist empowerment within textiles, the more it interested me." And I just think it's a great use of that meme and great sort of combining contemporary methods with these wider histories. Now, while the examples covered today are by no means exhaustive, I hope it throws a bit of light onto the gendered history of the art-craft divide. And I wanted to leave the final words again to Rosika Parker in The Subversive Stitch, who encourages us to question our intentions with regard to bridging this divide. She wrote, "The art-craft hierarchy suggests that art made with thread and art made with paint are intrinsically unequal, that the former is artistically less significant. But moving embroidery several rungs up the ladder of art forms could be interpreted as simply affirming the hierarchical categorizations rather than deconstructing them. So maybe we need to deconstruct this arbitrary hierarchy of arts and crafts, and I will leave it to you, as largely practitioners, to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amber. And now there is a coffee break upstairs, and we sit down here again at 3:30.